I'm again very honored to be here. Thank you again. I see many familiar faces. Yeah, let's just start. I see many familiar faces, so it's good. We're going to talk today about love. So I hope that you come to talk about love because I think there is an amazing marriage opportunity between learning design and learning analytics. We will also be working again in smaller groups, and you will be drawing, hopefully, some nice pictures, maybe about love. Um, so what I want to do is to give a brief overview of learning analytics and learning design. Then you are going to do some work because you're going to do a hands-on exercise. And then I'm going to inform you a little bit about what does the research actually say, why there's such an amazing marriage between learning design and learning analytics. And like before, I've basically sent the slides um, to Joseph, so he's happy to share the slides afterwards. And then I will briefly talk about, can we actually change teachers based on what we know about learning design and learning analytics, and then hopefully come up with a conclusion. Before I do that, I do a shameless plug. This is advertisement. Every year we predict the future. And every year we write a report, so-called Innovative Pedagogy report. We did this with Stanford University, we did this with the National Institute of Education from Singapore, we did this with an Israeli institute, and this year we did this with Slate, which is a university in Bergen in Norway. And we predict the following 10 big trends, and this report is freely available online. Sometimes we predict the trends well. So we predicted in 2012 learning analytics, we predicted MOOCs, we predicted design-based research. Sometimes we get it completely wrong, but these are our trends. So we think that perhaps learning with robots will become big. And we think, for example, that increasingly virtual studios will become a place where people learn. So no longer having to come to lectures, they can just go online. So if you're interested, this report is freely available online. I forgot to include in several of my other slides pictures of my amazing team. So I always seem to present it as an individual person, but actually the real work is done by these amazing people. So they do all the hard work, and I'm very eternally grateful for them. So briefly, who has seen this definition before? Just raise your hand. Has anyone seen this definition before about learning analytics? I probably should have started with that definition 2 weeks ago. So this is the formal definition, which states that learning analytics is the measurement, collection, analysis, and reporting of data about learners and their context for the purposes of understanding and optimizing learning and the environments in which they occur. Personally, I don't really like that definition, because if we would use the approaches that we've developed in our institution and copy paste that in your institution, that probably will not work. So my colleague Rebecca Ferguson has added the word social learning analytics, which basically has the same definition, but it acknowledges that it focuses on how learners build knowledge together in their cultural and social settings. So it's not just collecting lots of data and then hoping that it will work. We have to recognize that the culture and context in which we learn plays a big role. So now that we know what learning analytics is, what is learning design? So I've shown to some of you this before. So learning design is described as a methodology for enabling teachers to make informed decisions about how they go about designing learning activities and interventions, which are pedagogically informed and make effective use of appropriate resources and technology. I briefly called this brain scanning of teachers, but perhaps the metaphor was not entirely clear. It's not literally that we're brain scanning teachers, but it's primarily trying to understand why do teachers make decisions in how they teach. So for example, now I'm lecturing you. I personally don't like lecturing, but it's a choice that I've made. But later on, I will design the lecture. Hey, welcome. I will design the lecture in a slightly different way where you are actually going to do some of the work. So I have showed this previously, but this is basically an overview of the 7 big categories of activities that we think teachers might consider when bringing together all these different activities. So all the way on the left, we have what we're currently doing. We're reading the slides, we're watching the slides, we're listening to my voice. Hopefully you're thinking, and maybe you're observing what I'm doing. On the other side of the equation are assessments. Rest assured, I won't do assessments today. I won't do assessments after all. But typically in any course, you would see that there are assessments that test whether or not a student understands the activity. So typically, he would either write, he would demonstrate, he would critique. In some of our arts courses, for example, we ask students to paint an interpretive painting, and that's then the piece of work that they present. And the middle bit is what I find is the more interesting learning design. So I showed you last week, Friday, for example, that lots of courses increasingly ask students to search for their own information because that's a key skill. In addition, there are lots of courses that encourage people to collaborate, and you will also communicate together today. So now I'm communicating to you. Hopefully you will start to communicate with each other. And then hopefully also you're going to communicate to me so that we're all starting to learn. Then today you will also be creative because you will do something today. You're going to build a certain profile, in this case of a learner. So you will create, you will design, you will construct. And then there are these 2 phases which I think perhaps in a face-to-face university are less relevant, but they could be relevant, is some of our courses use experiential learning. So you can, for example, go to, if you're studying astrophysics at our university, you can go to a virtual telescope and you can explore lots of interesting stars. And you don't have to go to the telescope that is in South Africa. You can just look at the screen and you can adjust the telescope wherever you are. Or similarly, we have online microscopes that allow you to look directly on real life species of, let's say, my hair. And similarly, there are interesting simulation games where you allow people to interact simultaneously online. So these are the kind of 6 flavors of learning design that we use, and typically teachers would mix and match these in a particular order. So what I would like to do now is basically do a hands-on exercise with you, and it's about, okay, what would a good course actually look like? What outcomes does a course provide? What are you learning at the end of the course? What does a good design look like? How can I measure whether the design that I've implemented is actively effective or not? How do I know which elements of the learning design worked and which elements didn't? And how would I know that if I'm teaching the same course that I teach for business students, but suddenly I teach it for law students, how would I know that these courses are effective or not? This is a quite nice comic. I will just give you a second to read it. I'm not going to say it out loud. So as teachers, we're always worried when students come to us that they might actually hate our design. But I think it's actually really nice to get to know what you want as students, and I know that there's some of you are students in this group, which is fantastic. So do make sure that you share your thoughts about what you like and don't like, because we as teachers really appreciate this. So when we interviewed students in a real life university about what elements they liked about learning design and what elements they didn't like, they came up with, okay, it's innovative, it's supportive, it's demanding, it's challenging. So there are lots of terms that students might use to describe a learning design. And what we try to do, and this is a picture of 45 senior executives in an African context, we were really interested to see, can we adopt our learning design approach, which was designed at the Open University, can we also adopt it in other universities? So I appreciate this is in Africa, so it's not in Hong Kong, but in general, these people really liked the learning approach, basically what I'm showing you today, but they also heavily criticized it. And there are 11 things that they criticized. One, and that's what you will also do today, one is this learning design approach is interesting, but we need more information about the specific student demographics. Who are the students that we're actually teaching? Furthermore, we need to understand what are their specific needs. The learning design approach gives a framework of how I teach, but it doesn't necessarily allow us to see, okay, what do students actually want? They also wanted to provide more flexibility in terms of how students are studying, but depending on different working patterns. And what was quite interesting, and I will show you this because this will not make a lot of sense, but in a minute, you will draw up a so-called student profile. And they were saying, well, in addition to getting a better understanding of student profiles, we perhaps should also get a better understanding of typical teachers. And they thought it was quite interesting. They also said that no matter how good your learning design is, if your infrastructure is not good, it's quite difficult to implement this in real life. And you have to build the kind of capacity of human resources around it to design these courses. So in a way, what they're trying to say is it's great that we're doing this learning design, but there are lots of other factors that might influence whether or not learning design can be an effective way forwards to better improve our students' outcomes. So I talked a lot about these student profiles. So these are student profiles of actual teachers, and they basically use these student profiles to think about what is a typical student that comes to my class? What would that student look like? Or alternatively, I'm not interested in the typical student. I want to design a course that addresses a unique student that I know struggles in my environment, or a student that I think can do really, really well, but is not completely catered by the needs of this. So what I would like you to do now is to think about, okay, what if I would like to design my own course? Or what if I, as a student, because I appreciate some of you are students, how would I want to be treated as a student? So you can come up with your own identity. So you can basically say, my name is Bart Rienties, I'm 42 years old. Or you can just make up an imaginatory identity, and you can just say, if I were a student studying at HKSYU, I'm 21, I'm a female, and blah, blah, blah. You see what I'm trying to do? So what I would like to do, because I didn't expect there would be so many people, which is great, is I have 15 copies. So what we perhaps could do row per row is that you're working in teams of 2 or 3, and I'm going to give you 10 minutes, and you can fill in this form in any language you want, including Cantonese. I won't be able to read it, but it's fine. And then maybe later on, it would be really interesting to hear what your thoughts are about this student. So is it clear what I'm trying to ask? Yeah? Okay. So how's the drawing going? How many more minutes do you need? Couple of more minutes? Yeah? Okay. So who would be ready to fully anonymously, of course, share their amazing student? Is there anyone who would like to volunteer? Rest assured, you will all have to share your student. So, anyone that feels comfortable to start? Or you're still working on your student? Okay, a bit. I think you're ready, right? Yeah? Yeah? Okay. So you can stand up if you want, or you can stay, you can come to the stage. I'm giving you a microphone so you can just talk as much as you want. So talk us about your student.
My student is male. His name is Peter, and he is 28 years old. And his first language is English. And what he wants to learn is Cantonese because he really loves Hong Kong. He's got a T-shirt of "I love Hong Kong" here.
That's amazing.
Yeah. So his motive, because he wants to stay in Hong Kong and work here, so that he must learn Cantonese. And his study skill strengths is he really loves the challenge and he is very creative. And his skill weakness is he has really bad memory because for my experience of my expat friends, they all think Chinese characters is really difficult to learn how to write it. They think it's a picture, but if you have a really bad memory, you don't remember all the characters. So, and he has a reading disorder as well. So, I'm not sure how we can help him to learn Chinese. And he's living alone in a very small subdivided flat in Hong Kong because he can't afford to pay the rent. And his educational experience is undergraduate. And what he likes to be study in is like a workshop to learn Cantonese, and it must be face to face because he thinks that if you learn anything online is it's okay now because we have video chats and it's okay, but it's still good to know more local people to learn the language. Yeah,
Fantastic.
so he really hates lectures, well, because it's boring. Okay, my student.
Thank you so much. Well done. Is there anyone here in this room that thinks like, okay, this could really work for Peter? How would we design a course for Peter who has a reading disorder? We don't know exactly the reading disorder, but it could be.
I think it's English because his first language is English.
Mhm,
If he
okay.
has reading
Yeah.
disorder, it must be English. Maybe he can learn some other language where.
So would there be any ideas in terms of, okay, now that you know a little bit more about this particular student, what would you advise? Give up. So what to me is quite interesting that this student has a clear preference for face-to-face and doesn't like online, which is interesting. I'm not an expert in Cantonese because I also don't speak Cantonese or Chinese, but I'm assuming that there will be lots of materials online already to learn the language, yes? So why wouldn't those materials be good enough for Peter?
I think because he is an artist, he likes to know the person as well as the language, not just the language.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then typically in language education, when we design courses, it's not only important to know indeed, in this case, the characters and the meaning of the characters. It's also not only about reading, it's also about being able to write and, of course, to talk, to have the dialogue. And that, of course, is quite difficult when you design an online course unless you do one-to-one chats with, for example, a tutor. Okay, that is really interesting. Does anyone use Duolingo? Have you heard about the app called Duolingo? It's a free app. It's the mostly used app to learn a language, and it's really super smart. It allows you to learn a language quite quickly. And the reason why it's for free is that every time when something is for free, you are the product. So how Duolingo works, I met the guy in Cornell University or Carnegie Mellon 2 years ago. You're, for example, reading, I can't speak Cantonese, but there is a dog or there is a cat. And then you have to translate this, let's say, in French or in Cantonese, right? But actually the word there is and there is a dog, cat, actually is coming from a website. So, for example, news websites like CNN or the BBC, they offer languages for the same content for different languages. So what the system does, it uses the people who are learning the language to test what the language says in a different language. I'm not explaining this very well, but there are really interesting tools for free that could potentially work. Is there anyone else who would like to share their amazing student? Because Peter is a 20-year-old man from England. Is there anyone else that would like to share? Yes, I can see you're smiling. Very good. Go ahead.
Thank you. I have a question. So I'm not sure about the contest rate. So we have a student 11 years old. Is that okay?
Yeah, of course.
Okay, sure.
It's your student.
So this is Anson and male. So Cantonese is his first language, and he is a local Hong Kong, so living in a middle class family and having a full-time mom.
Yeah.
Okay, and dad is actually a business owner, and he's studying maths here.
Okay.
And the practical needs, talking about the problem-solving skills related to maths, and he needs more confidence on that. And he is, although he's a teenage boy, but he's actually having a very tidy handwriting and a proper person, and he actually hates rules, and he loves being motivated by peers and teachers' recognition, and having a sense of achievement to him is actually very important. And he likes games, all right, interactions, and he loves IT, always having an iPad on his hand. And if you have some interesting problem, though not too difficult problems, he will be fine with it. And he dislikes punishment, lecturing, boring stuff, and yeah, more or less like that. And if you allow him to express more in class, he'll be happy to do so. And one of the very important weaknesses is that he's afraid of making mistakes. So more or less like that. That's Anson.
Cool.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. And remind me the name of the student?
Anson.
Anson. Okay. Yeah. Wow, this is a really interesting, clear case that you have in your mind. So thank you for sharing that. So there are some clear preferences for this particular student, right? So going back to the learning design, would this student benefit from this type of design with lots of reading and watching? No, right? Could he benefit from just finding more math problems online and how to solve them? For example, going to the Khan Academy. The Khan Academy provides continuous math problems and you can just solve it via that. Would that work? Perhaps, maybe not. Okay. What about this space here? Would that work? There are tons and tons of really cool math exercises online, either in more formal math settings where it's kind of adaptive testing, like McGraw has developed a system called ALEX, which is adaptive knowledge-based theory. And there you continuously get exercises. And with ALEX, it quite quickly identifies if you are, let's say, if you imagine the entire math space as a tree, ALEX is with KS, it quite quickly, after asking 20 questions, it identifies quite clearly, okay, this student is exactly at point 25 on a particular tree. And then there are multiple pathways that students can explore. And by continuously exercising and continuously making math exercises, it's a kind of a game. You continuously are testing. That could work really well. There's also an online program called Assist, where you actually have a real tutor that provides direct feedback on how well you're performing. So I guess the student probably would look for kind of interactive environments. Would that particular student also be interested to communicate with other students about math, or would it just be fine to study individually?
As said, so he's actually not so confident of presenting himself or ideas. That's why it may not be suitable for him. Or maybe we can find some ways to encourage him. We're not sure.
And what about anonymously helping?
Maybe.
Yeah, because there is a friend of mine, Stefan Stemblom. He developed an online tutor where people could anonymously post questions to an online tutor. And this was done at the University of Oslo. And if students then get stuck, they can basically talk anonymously. And eventually some of the students became the tutors. So perhaps this could be a quite nice way in a kind of safe environment to learn and to communicate. So I guess for your student, probably you're thinking about designing activities here, maybe activities here, perhaps here, and I guess also here in terms of continuously giving students small exercises where you continuously get, oh, you're doing great, keep going. And that could really potentially encourage his motivation and confidence. Okay, that's great. What about your student? Where would he be on this framework? I give you some time to reflect. Or do you want to say it now?
I think experiential. Yeah. Yeah, because he can go out and explore the city and talk to anyone on the street. They can speak Cantonese. Even he can't understand. He may learn it through everyday life. When he orders some food, he may say the same words, and then he can learn that word. Yeah.
And then, for example, Duolingo, the app that I was talking about, eventually once you're able to recognize words, it also can automatically test your pronunciation. So it's a kind of experiential version of there is a cat on the street. If you can pronounce it quite well in Cantonese, it can experientially check whether or not this works. I'm looking for a final volunteer. Who is willing to share their final student? Surely there must be one. No? That's fine. I mean, I don't mind. But in a way, what to me is interesting when you're doing this exercise, we've just done 2, right? But these 2, I'm not saying this is representative for all possible scenarios. But none of you have come up with, hey, let's design a lecture. Who had in their description, I want to be lectured? Probably no one, right? But still, we design all these courses based on all these different feelings of students, but none of them actually the solution is lecturing. I'm not saying that lecturing is bad or reading a book is bad. It's just we have to think about, when we think about what students want, there might just be a kind of mismatch. Yeah? So, did you enjoy that exercise? Yeah? Okay. Any more volunteers? Okay. If not, some of you have already seen this, but I'm gonna repeat this to a little extent, because the reason why we do this kind of activities is all the teachers that are using this learning design, they have to think about their students. So we typically would have 4 or 5 students that we designed a course for with different profiles. And then eventually they come up with the course that they actually design. So I've showed you this course before. So this is this computer programming course. So this teacher, an introduction to computer programming, decided, okay, I'm going to design 10 hours of the basics of computer programming. And then at the same time, I'm going to ask my students 1.5 hours in that particular first week to find information about what is Java or what is HTML, so to activate their prior knowledge. And then they had to discuss for 1 hour, for example, who has experience of programming in Java? What do you like about Java? What don't you like about Java? So at least trying to develop some kind of community. And they actually had to develop a small task, like, I don't know, writing some code and then giving it to their next door neighbor and then asking them, what does this code say? And this particular teacher, as I've shown previously, in week 5 had his first assessment. And in this week 5, he designed an experiential task of 19 hours, where the students actually had to build something in Java. And then they also had to be assessed on that particular task, aka, does the Java program work? And this particular teacher then put these numbers together, and it led to 35 hours of hard work. And we encourage students in our university to work only 10 hours for one module. We have typically 2 to 3 modules at the same time. These are part-time students. So this is well above the workload. So what it then allows us to do is, this is the brain scan of the teacher. This is what a teacher expects students to do. And then we can see to what extent students are actually doing this. That's where learning analytics comes into place. So this learning analytics can take many shapes and many forms. So what we have thus far done is we've mapped this kind of exercise with 300 modules, and we've linked this with student feedback data, we've linked this with how well students are performing, and we've linked this with how well students are progressing over time, and we did this with a quite big data set. So I've given you this thing before. This is a memory test. So for those who are on their phone, remember how to get to this website? So if you go with your phone or with your laptop to polev.com and then /my name 552. So if you go to polev.com /my name 552, don't have to register. You can do it anonymously. You can just say, just call me Bart or whatever. So everyone probably has an idea of the institution I'm working at. I'm working at the Open University UK. So if you think about the courses that we're designing and thinking about the learning design we had, do you think that we have a lot of materials and lots of assessment? Or do you think that there's just a lot of assessment? Or do you think it is very interactive when you study at an online distance program? Or, and this is what a colleague this afternoon said to me, was it has a lot of productive activities, so it's a lot of doing things. That's what she thought that the Open University was doing. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of time to log into the system, give you a little bit of time to see and look around. And you can immediately see a learning effect, because I have already showed you this slide before and you've remembered this. Well done. So indeed, courses at the Open University typically have a lot of stuff and a lot of assessments. So indeed, the right answer, and I've shown you this previously, is you can see lots of, on average, assimilative design, so lots of watching and reading, and lots of assessment relative to the others. And then previously, we did already this exercise where you could indicate where you think your courses, how they look like. And now that I've explained a little bit more about learning design, and if you think again about perhaps the answer that you have been given, if you think again to your own course that you're currently following, which of those elements, which of those 7 elements do you think is most important, most dominant in terms of the learning activities? So on your phone, you can just pick, oh, I think it's productive, or I think it's still assimilative. Somebody said, oh, it's actually very interactive. So it's nice. Let's see how it develops over time. And again, there's no right and wrong, and the green dots basically are green dots. And I think we've finally achieved something that I was looking for a long time, which is good. The poll is full, which basically means that thus far already 40 people have filled in this particular thing, which is nice. But after 40 accounts, you have to pay, and of course, I don't have money. But in this free, so what is quite interesting is if you compare yourself to the Open University, except for this one, the poll seems to be very similar in terms of the design. There are not many people who, for example, say, oh, in my course, I do lots of experiential activities. Or in my course, I do a lot of finding information. So perhaps the Open University design, in a way, is what you're familiar with. So coming back to this programming task, which I've shown you already previously, this is a slightly different way of visualizing this. So in week 5, we had this interactive element, we had this assimilative element, and we had this assessment. And what you see is another red line, and this other red line is the actual engagement by students. So what you see is the teacher expected no learning activity to happen in week 4, but actually that was the week where there was most engagement. So the teacher had an idea of a course, but students, rightfully, did something slightly different. And similarly, in a different course, we found quite similar patterns. Like every time when there is an assessment, students are quite active at the Open University. See here for the final assessment. But when there's no assessment, the typical engagement is relatively low. What I've already shown you previously is the way how we design courses fundamentally influences what our students are doing. So the 69% basically means that if I would give 10 lectures, and on 10 lectures I would change the way how I teach. So for example, on 7 lectures I do interactive activities. I can change most of you just by doing this small change. So there is a tremendous power by us as teachers to influence students. And this learning design can really help teachers to design more interesting courses. And I've shown you this already before, so I'm not going to dwell too much on this. But what we have found is that the way how teachers design courses significantly influences their satisfaction and how well they're performing over time. So then the next question obviously is, if we know that teachers have such an important influence on students, can we change teachers? Very simple question. Maybe we don't want to change teachers. Maybe the teachers know best. But is it possible using learning analytics data, is it possible to change teachers? So, what did we do? So, this is actually how learning design works. So, we work in small teams with the teachers. So of course you don't see the teachers, but these are the teachers designing the courses. And then with color cards on week per week, they're designing, okay, in week 1 I want students to read an introduction to psychology. But not only do I want them to read the introduction to psychology, I also want them to see an interesting video. And also in week 1 I want them to perhaps go and do an initial experiment, perhaps with their parents or perhaps with a friend. So they're all thinking about what kind of activities do we want to do in week 1, what kind of activities do we want to do in week 2, etc., etc. And this is jointly constructed by those teachers. So the only thing we did differently by changing teachers is this approach was basically done in a workshop and then the teachers left. And they eventually put this online. So the only thing we did differently was for 80 other teachers, we initially designed their actual visualization. So we designed based on this, we translated this into, okay, what would it mean in practice? And the day after they came back, and they reflected then, ooh, maybe the workload in week 4 is a little bit high. Maybe the workload in week 7 is a little bit low. So the only thing we basically did was to give them this and a bit of our research. So if you go back to your Poll EV, so to your phone, do you think by just visualizing the initial design decisions of teachers, do you think that we can change the way teachers design courses? So option 1, nothing, as teachers know what they're doing, obviously. 2, by giving these visualizations, it leads to even more assimilative activities. Option 3, it actually leads to more socio-constructivist activities, like, for example, communication, potentially allowing the Peters and Ansons of this world to perhaps have that dialogue about mathematics, or perhaps to have that dialogue about learning Cantonese? Or do you think that by visualizing initial design decisions, that it leads to more assessment? So I'm giving you ample opportunity to think. There's no right and wrong. But most of you either have read my paper or have by mere chance selected the right answer. Oh, sorry, it's my alarm, sorry. So let's have a look at what it actually meant. So the blue are teachers, these are 80 teachers who were not giving this visualizations, they were just doing the workshop as they always do. And the orange were the so-called teachers who were given these changes. So what I would like you to do now, maybe in just in groups, just in pairs. Why do you think, or what do the results show, and why do you think that these teachers changed or didn't change? So just for 2 minutes, just discuss in your group what has happened based on this experiment. Go ahead. So maybe if we solve the problem together, because solving a problem together always is easier than solving it individually. What do you see in this visualization, first of all? Is there anyone who would like to share what they see in this visualization? So what does this change? What does this mean? less reading, less providing video materials, less providing just lectures and stuff. And why would a teacher decide to do this? You would hope that he would have read our research. Obviously they haven't. But at least by visualizing the workload, perhaps they realize, oh, maybe I'm offering too much materials to read. Okay, so we've unpacked one puzzle. What happens in this part? Any ideas? So although finding information has gone up from 4% to 12%, and you could argue, well, is that big? Is that small? It's basically 3 times more tasks are given to students to basically find for themselves information relative to before. And I think the biggest change is this. Although numerically it's not the biggest change, but conceptually it is probably a big change. If you remember from the typical OU course, most courses had no communication. So the fact that they've doubled the amount of communication with students is quite substantial. And our research has shown that a 1% increase in communication leads to 0.5% increase in retention. So if you think about this and do the math, these are 80 teachers who typically teach courses of 1,000 students. So this change in design influences 80,000 students. The typical dropout of those 80,000 students is 40%. If you think about this, is 40%, give or take, that's simple math, just let's say that's 30,000 students. But with those 5% increase in communication, we're predicting that 2.5% of those 80,000 students are more likely to continue. 2.5% of 80,000 is, give or take, it's not an exact science, but it's nearly 2,000 students. 2,000 students who we could potentially save. 2,000 students times 75,000 Hong Kong dollar that you're paying tuition fee. That's a lot of money. Imagine that I would get that in my pocket. It would be quite nice. Unfortunately, the Open University doesn't work like this. But even these small changes, if you do this with thousands and thousands of students, it will save a lot of money. But more importantly, it will give students the opportunity to do some really interesting things. So the final question that I would like to ask to you is, I've talked a lot about students following the learning design, and I've previously showed you that 69% of students are following what the teacher says they should do on a weekly basis. But are they actually following it the way the teacher is describing it to do? Or are they studying perhaps a couple of days in advance? Or are they perhaps studying a couple of days behind time? So, do you think that most students follow the course schedule when studying? And the vast majority of you again have read my papers, very good. The vast majority indeed is not following the course schedule. So when I meet my teachers, when we're having this learning design meetings, they're like, yeah, but in week 3 they have to do this and this and this and this, and it's really important that they do this in week 3. But what we find is that often students are not studying in week 3. They're studying in week 1, or they're already 4 weeks ahead in time, but the teacher thinks that the student is in week 3. And this is very nicely visualized, and I do apologize, this looks quite complex, by this very nice visualization. So I've shown you this briefly before, but I'm going to explain it in slightly more detail. So imagine that these are all the tasks that a student has to do, but we have anonymized it so you can't see what the tasks are. So this is week 1, week 2, week 3, week 4, etc., etc., etc. Sorry, the task in week 1, 2, 3, 4. And these are the actual weeks in which the student are studying. So if a student is studying exactly on time, that would be a straight line going through that. But what you see is that so-called excellent students spend a lot of time pre-reading. Because you can see in terms of the heat map, when the colors are very intense, this means that lots of those students are doing this very intensively. But there are also certain periods in time when they are exactly on track. And that is probably when the assessments are, because then they have to do it in that particular week. But at the same time, lots of excellent students are catching up. And this catching up is not necessarily negative, because the catching up could be, for example, this particular group of students revisits the materials of week 3, again at the end of the course when they're revising their activities. And you can see that certain activities, like for example this one or this one, are revised more often. So from a learning design point of view, as a teacher, I would be interested, what are these activities? So maybe they are not well explained to the student, or maybe I need to pay more attention to this as a teacher. So if we flip through with the pass group, so these are students who passed the course, there's a subtle difference. If I flick through it, and I'm sorry if I cause a little bit of migraine, but the subtle difference is that in the pass group, there are slightly more students who are in the kind of catching up phase, rather than the studying in advanced phase. And then finally, if we look at the students who failed at the end, those failing students, some of them are really studying well in advance, right? You can see this from the heat map. But there are also lots of students who are revisiting some of those materials, and what our analysis seems to suggest, that these failing students are not failing, but they're just 1 week behind, 2 weeks behind, 3 weeks behind, and eventually they are so far behind, somewhere around here, that they decide to drop out. But these are potentially really good students, but they're just falling behind. So in terms of our learning design, what we do very badly at the Open University is A, not signaling to the students you're falling behind, but B, taking the metaphor of the MTR train. If you're a little bit late, why can't you just get on the next train, or wait another day and go on to the next train? That's what we're not offering. So you're absolutely right. If we add all these things together, most students are actually not studying when they're supposed to study, which is fascinating, I think. So it gives insights to teachers in terms of how they should think about their learning design. So well done. So what are the conclusions? The conclusions in a way are, and I think this is what you probably know, is that teachers are fundamentally important in terms of designing courses. And teachers fundamentally also influence what you as students are learning. So if you are not learning well, coming back to your description of Peter, maybe this has nothing to do with Peter. Maybe it has something to do with the mismatch between the learning design and what the student actually wants. And I hope that I've shown that by combining learning analytics with learning design, we can start to unpack why is it successful for some and why is it perhaps not so successful for others. And if you're interested in this, I think what is really cool is that with all this data, you can ask really fundamental questions like, should communication be 5%, 6%, 7%? What kind of communication is best? Should it be student to teacher, etc., etc.? And as I've said before, I'm open to wild collaborations and wild ideas. So with that, hopefully you're convinced that learning analytics and learning design is a marriage made in heaven. Thank you. So I'm sure there must be some questions that you might have. Because normally when we give these workshops of learning design, it's normally a 2-day workshop, so I've rushed it quite quickly. So are there any questions